Number 15 is God's Demon by Wayne Barlowe. An author who's typically not an author, or wasn't typically an author. He is best known as a visual artist. He did a lot of covers for science fiction and fantasy books, and he would also do these art books that were these grand projects, these like, almost want to call them concept albums, but that's really stupid. I'm sure that there's a more apt bit of terminology for that in the art world, but he would do these collections, maybe that's it, of paintings based on original concepts that he had, including one called Expedition that I've talked about elsewhere before. That's a bunch of science fiction paintings of animals that he imagined living on an alien world, all tied together with a bit of connective text. And he also did a project, 2 different art books. The first one called Barlowe's Inferno, that were his vision of hell, a hell that was painted as if it were a planet in a science fiction property. And those paintings are sublime. This is his first novel that he set in that hell world, following a fallen angel in a process of trying to appeal to heaven to be let back in, despite the best efforts of his adversaries who rule over warring kingdoms. This hell is like this slate wasteland. All the ground is shale, this gray stone, and darkness reigns, and there are these weird wild animals roaming around. And it's like high fantasy horror. It reads like a typical high fantasy book, but obviously with very different aesthetics. On a literary level, this is not a masterstroke. It's decent. The characters, decent. I tend not to be all that interested in the big dynastic, high fantasy, warring kingdoms type literature to foreshadow the rest of the list. But this, both because it's Wayne Barlowe and he's my favorite genre artist, and I love him, and also just because I think it's cool, it's on the list. Number 15. 14 is, I guess, like the first couple books of the Elric saga, Elric of Melnibone, an anti-Tolkien, by Moorcock's accounting, fantasy about a dying empire, or an empire in the waning days of its power, of these elf-like, pseudo-immortal, am I remembering correctly? Probably not. They rule over people, treat us as their vassals and their slaves and their prey, I think. They kill for sport. Am I remembering correctly? I don't know. That's the spirit of it, though. It's a rather dark fantasy following Elric, the heir apparent, or the recent heir to the throne of this kingdom, and he is disinterested in worldly politics, has dialogues with old gods, and wanders the surface of his world, getting into adventures, including a sentient talking sword that eats souls, a trope that I think became a little bit familiar over time. I remember great atmosphere. I don't remember super riveting storytelling. There are bits, like images of it, that definitely linger in memory. There's a part where he goes into the place. Is it where he finds the sword? You can tell it's been a while. I'm sorry, it's been a while since I read these. He goes into this chamber that's like a womb, this organic cave that has these opening and closing mucosal orifices. It's like doom metal, sword and sorcery-esque, high-ish fantasy. There's a bunch of follow-up books that Moorcock wrote later. I think there have been 3 or 4 different waves of Elric stories. I'd like to read whatever the basic consensus first run of the Elric stuff was. Number 13, 9 Princes in Amber, the first book in Zelazny's Chronicles of Amber. It's about a guy waking up from a coma with amnesia and coming to find out that he's the heir to an interdimensional kingdom where the throne has been abdicated in the death of his father, and he is one of 9 different siblings, all vying for power. I think there are maybe notes of Shakespeare in there, although the writing is distinctly non-Shakespearean, has a lot of pop culture references that were contemporary with the 1970s when this was written. 1970, precisely. That stuff gets on my nerves, but We won't fault Zelazny for that. It's a gripping enough read. Definitely feels a bit like reading science fiction, which is, if you're new to the channel, is mostly what I read. I mostly read sci-fi, so a lot of the books on this list just sort of like fell into my open mouth by chance, because I do random picks of books a lot, or at least I used to, and I've just kind of accumulated a bunch of fantasy stuff, sometimes half by accident. So I'm not a committed, die-hard fantasy reader yet, although I am opening up to it. Used to be a rude dude with a two. Used to have a kind of churlish opinion about fantasy fiction just because I hadn't really read that much stuff that I thought was that great. And I just wasn't that interested. I'm more interested now, but that's a long way of saying I think I maybe liked Amber because it reads like science fiction. Then House on the Borderlands by William Hope Hodgson, published in 1908. A very important bit of weird fiction. Two friends go on a trout fishing trip to Western Ireland and happen upon the ruins of an old home, and they find an old journal that is most of the book. So the fishing guys are a frame narrative, and then they kind of vanish, and then it's the story of the original occupant of the property who finds a big sinkhole, like this giant well on his property, and these weird pigmen come out of it and besiege his house. It's, I think, maybe the first besieged by monsters in a closed house, Night of the Living Dead type story. And then it gets into Olaf Stapledon territory, or what would become Stapledon territory. Now that I'm remembering, this book predates Star Maker, where there is a celestial disembodied voyage to the ends of the universe that's really weird and rife with very potent images. And Hodgson, I really like, but it's almost in spite of his talents as a writer. Like, his prose is not that strong, but the imagery is really vivid. General consensus is that this one is his most important and best work. I disagree. There's another Hodgson coming up on the list that I just personally like better, even though it's more annoying than this one is. House on the Borderlands, still very good. And then I'm doing two together, basically. It's The Worm, Ouroboros, and then Mistress of Mistresses, both by E.R. Eddison. I feel okay talking about these all together. One, because it's hard to differentiate them in my mind, even though they are different stories, and they were published, I think, 10 or 15 years apart. Let's find out. 1922 to Worm, for Worm, Ouroboros Worm, and then 1935 for Mistress, O Mistresses, 13 years. Ouroboros is an annoying word, so I'm going to call it The Worm, as many Eddison heads call it. It is a book that he started writing when he was a little kid, and you can tell because it has a weird sense of childish playfulness, especially in the naming of the characters, that he got a lot of flack for at the time, including from one J.R.R. Tolkien, his main op. That's not true. They were pals. They were all in the Inklings together. He was a member of the Inklings along with JRT and CSL. What started as fun little stories that he wrote when he was a kid turned into this enormous high fantasy opus about two warring kingdoms on the planet Mercury that really is just a fantasy version of Earth. Warring kingdoms of potentially supernatural beings, although they're all described physically as merely human, except for the demons of Demon Land are heroes who have horns that's mentioned one time and then not ever again, who are at odds with the goblins of Goblin Land, who again are just guys and gals in castles, as is the case with the demons. There's another frame narrative where a guy from Earth is transported to Mercury as a disembodied observer and watches as war threatens to break out between Demon Land and Goblin Land, following on from a joint effort to rid Mercury of the scourge of these undescribed evil creatures called ghouls, who are implicitly described as zombies, I think, or unthinking, non-sapient menaces. They teamed up along with other smaller kingdoms on Mercury to defeat the ghouls, and then the goblins are using that moment as an opportunity to get a wedge in to play power politics with Demonland and to threaten them with invasion if they don't bend the knee. In a Patreon review, I described E.R. Eddison jokingly as extremely, really boring Eddison. And that is deserved and not deserved. I was being funny, but also not being funny because it's a tough read. It is rather archaic language based on, I'm not entirely sure, I think it's Elizabethan English is the right term. In parts, there's actual, what I think is Middle English in their written correspondence that is transcribed. He didn't overhear them reading these letters out loud, but the letters, the correspondence is written in Middle English with the Y's and the E's and the weird F's and all that. Can be rather challenging to read, also moves along both of these books at a very stately pace, which is to say very little happens outside of long discourses between the characters, and when stuff does happen, a lot happens, and it's a very interesting counterpoint with Lord of the Rings in that The Worm, published 1922, long before The Hobbit or Fellowship of the Ring, has a lot of, not a lot of, but enough implied actual sexual content to differentiate it from Lord of the Rings. It's also rather violent, rather graphically violent. The portrayal of the female characters is much more realistic, and you could almost call it progressive than in Lord of the Rings. And overall, even though it is older than Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and even though it is written in a more archaic way, an accessible way than those books, it feels more contemporary to me than Lord of the Rings. Another thing that differentiates these books from, I think, all other fantasy that I've read is that it's a purely aristocratic story. The peasant class is just almost invisible, possibly on purpose as a bit of satire, possibly not. The Worm is, I think, maybe a little better than Mistress of Mistresses. I don't know. It's really hard to say. Mistress of Mistresses is more philosophical. Another important point of departure between Eddison and his contemporaries, Tolkien, and to a much larger degree, Lewis, is that Eddison did not write this as Christian allegory. And it's not just not Christian, it has a pagan character because those are the myth traditions that he drew on to write this work. Norse mythology, Greek mythology, so on and so forth. Actually, Mistress of Mistresses, more than The Worm, has that sort of almost like mysticism tone. It reads more like myth than The Worm. And Mistress of Mistresses is slower, also more beautiful. And Eddison, even though he is extremely, really boring Eddison, wrote that sort of mythopoetic prose better than anybody, better than George MacDonald, better than, I mean, Tolkien really didn't do it, but that's A+, that's the choice, that's the real. Next we have Lord of the Rings, which I do actually enjoy reading more than Eddison. I don't know, I could swap Lord of the Rings and the books that I just described, I think, and not lose any sleep over it. I actually had a negative opinion of Lord of the Rings for a long time. I finally finished Fellowship of the Ring and then went on to complete the cycle, finish Two Towers, which is my favorite of the three books, although Lord of the Rings really was meant to be published as a single book. And then more recently finished Return of the King. And obviously it wound up on this list. I like Lord of the Rings. I think I was wrong, more or less wrong about Fellowship of the Ring. I think I just have more tolerance to read boring stuff, which was my big note of criticism, is just Fellowship of the Ring, at least for a kid, was punishingly boring and slow. I know that I'm not the only person who feels that way about it, and I just never got over the hump, and I never saw the bigger vision, largely because I didn't read the bigger vision. Now I have. Now I think it's pretty good. I also think that it's good in much the same way that other fantasy around it and before it was good. And I think that my reading of Lord of the Rings was positively colored by reading stuff like Eddison at the same time, or like in between reading the Tolkien books, reading William Hope Hodgson, reading more weird fiction. I think Lord of the Rings bears more resemblance to that sort of stuff than maybe I would have gotten the impression just based on its place in the culture. And from, having my first impression of it been from the movies, even though I started reading Fellowship when I was a little kid before the movies came out, and then said, I'm gonna go play Pogs instead of reading this shit. Lord of the Rings, pretty good. The thing that I said about it in the Eddison bit, if you skip that one, go back and rewatch, that's your homework. There's no sex in it, not to be lascivious, not to say, I need my books to be horny, because I'm a genre reader and I'm horny. I don't just mean sex, I mean there's very little romance. Obviously there's the romance between Aragorn and Eowyn, not Eowyn, God, oh God. But it has this sort of like Star Trek Next Generation platonic thing going, you know what I mean? Where it's like the romance on Star Trek was platonic to the point where it was distracting and became gross in and of itself. Lord of the Rings is kind of the same thing, where it's so understated that it's conspicuous, that it's missing. If you haven't read, you've read it. If you're on this video, you've read Lord of the Rings. If you haven't read it, read it, because I think it is better than the movies. I'm referring it to it because, again, it was meant to be one book. Everybody's favorite factoid, including yours truly. Actually, one book. Read the book because the final chapter of Return of the King, I think, is my favorite part of the whole thing. It really brings home the anti-industrialism message that I think does give the story a slightly different meaning than what you get in the movies. And that is my favorite part. I think that's Tolkien really at its best. Next is The Hobbit. I like The Hobbit more than Lord of the Rings. I don't know how hot of a take that is. Probably not very. But I read The Hobbit when I was a little kid. I probably read it like 6 or 7 times over the course of my life. I like that the stakes are smaller. I like the characters. I like the ambiance. I don't like the songs. I'm sorry, I've never liked the songs. It's the Hobbit. Come on, it's The Hobbit. Come on, it's The Hobbit. That's my review of The Hobbit. Come on, it's The Hobbit. Next is the other William Hope Hodgson. It is The Nightland, a book that most people do not like. I love The Nightland. It is a book from 1912 that I could not believe was from 1912 when I read it. A lot of people say it's not fantasy, it's science fiction. 60% in agreement with them, but it'll never end up on a top 15 list for science fiction, so I'm going to shoehorn it in here, although it's not that much of a stretch. It's so out of time and out of place that God, it's so sick with 2 Qs. I'm going to give you an option to bail out onto the next book if you don't want anything spoiled, because I didn't know anything about it other than I held it up in a haul video and I had a bunch of people in the comments saying, Matt, read that. So I did, and I had no expectations. I had no knowledge of it going into it, and I was like jumping out of my body. It was just outrageous to me that it would be an obscure book. I will just say, if you're into stuff like Doom, if you're into dark fantasy, if you're into weird fiction, go seek out The Nightland and read it and get through the boring parts. The boring parts are record-settingly boring. Worth chewing your way through your own arm, to get out of the trap of that part of the book to get to the end. If you don't mind a little bit of it being spoiled. It's about this guy who's in love with his cousin. Again, 1912, weird time to be alive. She dies tragically, and then he, I think, goes into a coma or something, falls asleep, wakes up millions of years in the future after the sun has gone out, and the earth has been taken over by what are called demons, but it's implied they're aliens. And all of the remnant population of humanity all live in this massive steel pyramid that's protected by this force field. And at the top of the pyramid, there is a cast of like wizard seers, psychics, who are monitoring the wasteland around the pyramid and are in turn monitored by these enormous sphinx alien demon things that are moving so slowly that they look like they're completely still. There are 4 of them, one at each vertex of the pyramid, just eternally watching. The protagonist thinks that he's getting psychic messages from his deceased lover, decides to venture out into the outer wastes, dresses in a suit of armor, and arms himself with a pike that has a spinning saw blade on the end that shoots flame. Goes out, does battle with demons, and it just rules so much. And it's too bad that it's written in the way that it's written. It's written in this sort of hackneyed, bad, like archaic, false Elizabethan style that turns a bunch of people off. The writing itself is not that strong. Also, there's a long section of it that I've alluded to where it's just repetitious cycles of the protagonist falling asleep in a ditch, waking up, wandering around, falling asleep in a ditch again, waking up, wandering around. This lasts for like 100 pages or something. Also, the gender dynamics in it are god-awful. So there are bits of it that you should probably ignore. But I think for pure spectacle, nothing has touched Nightland. The City of the Singing Flame by Clark Ashton Smith is a weird fiction collection, the first that I've read from Smith. I read it recently, and Smith is now my favorite weird fiction writer. Smith is the best, not just because he doesn't have the weird like hang-ups of Howard and Lovecraft. He's also a better writer. He was a poet before he was a fiction writer, and you can tell. The prose is not as rich as someone like Eddison. In fact, I was expecting it to be more poetic, but reading Clark Ashton Smith is a lot more reminiscent to me of reading Cordwainer Smith or Jack Vance. He had Cordwainer's inventiveness and unpredictability. There's just something about a lot of those stories that are very Cordwainerian and distinctly Vancian, distinctly Dying Earth-esque, especially the Zothique stories that were a direct influence on Vance. I liked basically everything in this collection other than some of the more sword and sorcery type stories in the beginning that I think are just less inventive than the dimension hopping or sort of pseudo occult stuff. It definitely reads as pulp stories from pulp magazines, but you know, way, way, way above average. This book was really fun to read. I don't think it was terribly profound, any of it, although it wasn't shallow, but it delivered the feeling that I wanted out of Howard and out of Lovecraft, that I got a little bit out of Hodgson, but Smith is like the platonic ideal in my mind of what weird fiction probably should be, or what I want it to be. Next is The Eyes of the Overworld by Jack Vance, which is the second collection in his Dying Earth sequence. Dying Earth, Eyes of the Overworld, Kugel's saga. Let's just go with Kugel. It's time. It's time to switch the channel over from Cudgel to Kugel, and then finally Rail to the Marvelous. Dying Earth, the first one, is still my favorite, I think. It has been so long since I read these books that I have to put a big fat asterisk even on this recommendation because my tastes have changed quite a lot since then, and you know, memory can't fully be trusted. But Eyes of the Overworld is almost 0% science fiction. It does not blend in very much sci-fi with its fantasy. It's not high fantasy. It is described as a picaresque fantasy that follows Kugel, the mischief maker, the anti-hero, the scoundrel, the bastard, the asshole, as he goes on adventures in the Dying Earth, which is our Earth, set again millions of years in the future when technology has risen and fallen and risen and fallen, and now high-tech appears to us to be magic. It's never fully explained if it is high-tech or if it is actual magic or both, or maybe they're the same thing. Most of the population of the world has moved off planet, and the people who still live on Earth are ruled by wizards who live in castles, and the countryside is very dangerous, full of weird monsters, including the Deodans, which is one of my favorite monsters in all of genre fiction, who are these shadow people who speak in verse, or not verse, but they have this very elevated, flourishy language, as most Jack Vance characters do. I remember Eyes of the Overworld being both very, very beautiful and atmospheric in the way that the Dying Earth collection, I'll call it, is, and also pretty funny. If you haven't read The Dying Earth, read The Dying Earth first, but if you do like The Dying Earth, you haven't read this one, then read this one. Kugel Saga, which follows it, I also liked, but Eyes of the Overworld, to my memory, is the fantasy masterpiece amongst those books. Realms of the Marvelous is so-so to me. Knight's Master by Tanith Lee is a special book. It is a book that's a little hard to recommend because it is, in its content, probably the most extreme book on this list. It is another pseudo-Dying Earth book. A lot of people say that The Dying Earth by Vance was a main influence on Knight's Master. I think it's there, but I think it's more based on 1001 Nights and based, again, sort of like Eddison, on various strains of mythology, including Greek mythology and also Abrahamic myth. It's a big melting pot. Vance is in there somewhere, but honestly, I think it does read more like some of the Clark Ashton Smith stuff than it does like Vance. Human beings live on the surface of a flat Earth that is over an underworld presided over by an aristocratic class of demon lords who are all ruled by a demon king named something, not Azeroth, but it sounds like that. And the first section of it is about this Satan character doing something very evil. The book is written as if it were a fix-up of short fiction, but it is not. It was written as a novel, so stylistically it is rather distinct and interesting and kind of sly. And that first story sets you back on your heels and indicates to you that she's not going to be writing a conventional fantasy story, either in its thematics or in its structure, and I think it's one of the most inventive pieces of fantasy fiction that I've read. I think parts of it are really, really gorgeous. It has this rich allegorical quality. It's a series of vignettes that are loosely interrelated, all taking place either on the overworld or in the underworld, and sometimes characters transit between the two of them, are promised great powers by the denizens of the underworld, and the affairs of men and their dark overseers are intertwined. I think it's a wonderful book, wonderfully well constructed and conceived, and it is only the first of a sequence of books. I have all of them somewhere. I intend to read all of them. This is some of the best fantasy writing I've ever read. The Master and Margarita by Bulgakov. Some people would argue does not belong on a fantasy list. Bulgakov was a Russian who wrote this during the reign of Stalin in the USSR, so it was not published at large until 1967 when it was published in France after Bulgakov's death. It is about Satan visiting Moscow, appearing as a well-dressed man accompanied by a coterie of strange henchmen, including a talking cat. The novel is a satire of atheism. It's also a satire of the art scene in the Soviet Union or in Moscow during that time. It's also interspersed with a retelling of the story of Christ and Pontius Pilate. A lot of the cultural allusions were lost on me because I'm an American. I read it in 2022, I think, or 2023. So different time, different place, much different set of cultural references. Surely much of its subtlety is lost on me, but my God, what a beautiful book. Spellbinding, probably a corny word to apply to any book anywhere ever, much less a fantasy book. Here we go, it's spellbinding. I was spellbound. The sequences at the end are so incredibly beautiful. I don't really, connect with the book's core religious messaging, but I don't think that takes much away from the reading experience. Number 2, oh yes, we're at number 2, is The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany, published 1924. This is my favorite high fantasy. This is the purest, fantasy, capital F fantasy book that I've read. There's a world of mortal humans who live in this medieval countryside, and there's a mirror verse called Elfland that occasionally appears, and if you pierce through this shimmering membrane, you go into a world where time works differently. And there's a romance between a human man and an elf woman. The plot is not very complicated, but the language is absolutely beautiful. It's written with recurring refrains of these little snippets of poetry. Most notably, Dunsany refers to the land of mortals as the fields we know, and that phrase pops up again and again. So just for pure vibes, just pure beauty, it has never been topped for me. And a lot of the times that's really what I hope for and look for in fantasy fiction. Not these big mind-bending, paradigm-shattering big ideas or grave moral challenges that are often posed by science fiction. I do think I've seen science fiction do that better than I've seen fantasy fiction do it. I'm open to, open to and hoping for more exceptions to that pattern in reading more fantasy, which I intend to do. Feeling like you're encountering something otherworldly and ethereal and ancient and old, I think that is something that fantasy tends to do better than science fiction, and Dunsany in this does it better than anybody. My number one is Black Easter by James Blish. I have been cast in shadow. Let me adjust my camera settings, one sec. All right, hope that's better. Maybe it would have been more thematically appropriate just to lurk in the darkness to talk about this book. It is what I'll call a hard fantasy book. A lot of people refer to science fiction that has a lot of hard science exposition in it, actual science that's explained in the context of the plot of the book as hard SF, hard science fiction. Black Easter is the first and only hard fantasy book that I've read. Blish based it on occult texts from many centuries, dating back to the 1300s, I think. So it has the feeling of realism. It's also a wonderful bit of Cold War era satire of the military-industrial complex. It's about a general in the American military who enlists the help of a black magician in a world that looks just like our world, except magic is real in this world. There are light magicians and dark magicians, and the top dark magician or black magician, the general asks him if he will open a portal to hell for one night so that demons can roam the earth causing death and destruction, simply for this perverse lust for violence on the part of the general. The magician accepts and hijinks ensue. It's the first of two novels. There was a follow-up called After Such Knowledge that I actually read before I even knew about Black Easter because I found it at a thrift store. Incredibly lucky find. Black Easter is the real masterpiece. Day After Judgment is also excellent and should be read, especially for its ending, which is sublime. I think it is on par, if I'm being honest, with the ending of Case of Conscience, which Blish is still sort of famous for. And Case of Conscience is in the same thematically linked collection of works called the After Such Knowledge sequence. That's Case of Conscience, Black Easter, Day After Judgment, and Dr. Mirabilis. The After Such Knowledge books are all about Blish's worry that the secular pursuit of knowledge for the sake of knowledge might be a sin. And Black Easter is this powerful, beautiful, mordantly funny at times, infinitely interesting, and completely unique, as far as I know, cautionary tale about the limits of human power, the dangers of human ambition, and the dangers of militarism. If only all of Blish's books had been written to the level of the After Such Knowledge books. I haven't read Dr. Mirabilis. I've read all the other ones, and Black Easter is better than Case of Conscience. Even though Case of Conscience is much more famous, is much more widely read and celebrated, Black Easter is better. Black Easter is my favorite Blish. It is the best fantasy book I've ever read. And I guess this is the one exception to what I said in the Elfland's Daughter review, fantasy tends not to play with this set of stakes or confront you as a reader in the way that science fiction tends to be like more combative or challenging or provocative. I will remind you, I'm not a fantasy reader primarily, I'm a science fiction reader, and I know probably what's coming down the pipe is read Malazan, read Brandon Sanderson, read Joe Abercrombie, read George R.R. Martin, read Glenn Cook, read Robert Jordan. On that front, hey, you should read, 10 years worth of books that everybody says are only, half of them are good and the kind of mixed. No, thank you on Robert Jordan. The rest of them, like, I'll probably get to. I'll probably read Malazan at some point. I promise. No, I don't really, but I'll probably read Malazan at some point, but you don't. I know Malazan. I know it. I know. I also have a Patreon that costs $5. I have something like 130 videos up there. I review each book that I read in long form, tends to be between like 15 to 30 minutes per book. And I review those books right after I finish reading them, so my thoughts are really fresh. On YouTube, I tend to do batch reviews where I'll read like 3 to 5 books and then review them all together. But on the Patreon, you get my full unexpurgated thoughts about each book that I read, and I do other perks there. So if you like what I'm doing here on YouTube, you may like that. Something to consider. If not, no worries. See you soon, I hope. All right, thanks for being here.